This panel is entitled broadly Paving the Way to Statehood. So we are going to jump right in. Start with so Paul Dauphiné, is that right? Yes, sir. It's pretty good. A retired academic administrator, taught history at several institutions, including the University of Alaska. He's especially interested in how everyday people, those we rarely read about, make history. And his topic is structures, skills, and statehood, how the Second World War made Alaska statehood possible.
High tech, high problems, hang on. There we go. Good afternoon. Alaska Governor Ernest Gruning pointed out, quote, that wars are chiefly known as great destroyers, but they're also great constructors, especially in Alaska, end quote. The Second World War, at least in my opinion, was the foundation for Alaskan statehood. Improvements in infrastructure and communications provided by the military remained after the war. But more important than the buildings were the people who remained or returned after the war. The territory became militarized with numerous bases being built, and 300,000 people, either interconnected to the military, came to Alaska. It was the second major wave of incoming people since the purchase. This influx would have a greater and more lasting effect on Alaska than the Klondike Stampede some 40 years earlier, as these servicemen and women would either stay or come back after the war ended with their expertise, their entrepreneurship and skills to build a state. Communications in Alaska were historically poor because of infrastructure. Pete Peterson was in Bettles, above the Arctic Circle in the interior, when he received the news about the First World War and the need for men to fight. He immediately set out for the nearest recruiting station, Kodiak, and he started on a raft made of moose hides and alders. He kayaked part way, he walked many miles, and by the time he got to Kodiak, the war was over. The news took so long to get to him that he did not have the time, months, to get to a town where he could enlist. And while spared the need to go to war, Peterson was just a bit miffed that he had come all that way and was no longer needed. The situation had changed little by the 1940s because of Alaska's low priority for the Hawaii-Panama-Alaska Triangle. On July 2, 1942, Japan called up 1 million conscripts. On 4th of July, the commander of the Western Defense Command called an alert from Point Barrow to Panama. It took minutes for Panama and California to stand up. It took 4 days for the message to reach all the stations in Alaska. Radios were highly scattered, and in some cases, the message had to reach the far-flung station by airplane or runner because some of the stations had a receiver but no transmitter. In 1940, Alaska lacked the infrastructure that might make it a viable state. Not connected to the rest of the country by road, the only way in or out was via nascent air routes or slow, laborious, and very dangerous shipping lanes. From the coast to the interior, there was only a single road, the Richardson Highway, constructed in 1915 and barely maintained thereafter. And as an example of how little infrastructure there was, Ladd Field, initially an experimental station to learn about cold weather flying in Fairbanks, required more concrete than contained in all the roads and sidewalks in Alaska at the time. The largest existing airstrip was in Anchorage. Merrill Field was cleared in the 1920s and was a base for 41 civilian aircraft that could cover 90,000 square miles, but held less than 200 miles of roads. Between 1941 and 43, the military built 28 airfields in Alaska, ranging from Ketchikan to Kiska, and from Fairbanks to Kodiak. Nearly 300 military installations were built throughout the territory. Other construction included roads, telephone lines, railways, and pipelines. And the airstrips in particular were a huge addition to the territory and made air travel much, much easier. On the water, navigation was difficult. Aids to navigation were minimal when the war began, and only a single light operated in the Aleutian Islands. 55 ships were lost in Alaska waters during the Second World War, but few to enemy action. Most were sunk when they ran aground or foundered in bad weather. There was also a serious lack of skills coupled with substantial supply chain issues. On June 7 and 42, the Japanese took Attu and Kiska. 3 days later, U.S. forces bombed the island, for 3 days straight. After those 3 days, the United States was out of fuel, ammunition, and bombs. Aircraft engines were due for overhaul because of the running hours, but because there was so little expertise in Alaska, the work had to be done in the factory at Seattle. So while the physical aspects of the military presence were and continue to be important, it was the people, the skills they brought in their spirit, and their taking root, particularly, that really paved the way for statehood. People like Ed Klopp. Klopp enlisted in the Army Air Force shortly after Pearl Harbor. He came to Alaska via Canada with the U.S. Army as a radio operator in Norman Wells and Whitehorse. Norman Wells in Canada's Northwest Territory was an oil producing site that was important for Allied fuel needs in Canada and Alaska, and it was the beginning of the 1,800-mile-long canal pipeline. In Whitehorse, Klopp operated radios reporting weather and other conditions along the Lend-Lease route for aircraft heading from the U.S. to the Soviet Union. Klopp was then sent to the Aleutian Islands for the rest of the war. He first operated radios on Adak and Amchitka Islands. In October of 1943, he was sent with four other men to man a radio station on Boulder Island between Atoll and Kiska a few months after the Japanese left. The station was manned from then, October 43, until the end of the war. Boulder was so remote and desolate and difficult to get to that it was supplied by airdrop rather than by boat or ship. Ed's experience as an isolated radio operator enabled him to work in Alaska as a station manager for the Civil Aviation Administration, the CAA, the predecessor to what we know today as the FAA. After his discharge from the military, Klopp worked as a station manager at several CAA facilities. His first assignment was on Annette Island. In 1947, he transferred to Sheep Mountain, then to Anchorage, and later to Middleton Island. While Ed was in Alaska, Amber Jeffries was a Washington, D.C. civil servant who enlisted in the Women Marine Corps Reserve in 1942. After the war, she was sent to Alaska. She drove the Alcan to get here. And in Alaska, she worked for the district engineer at Fort Richardson. And then she was transferred to Canada. And as you can see, she made sergeant, pretty successful. And while she was in Anchorage, and Ed was on leave in Anchorage, they met. And they apparently hit it off. Because they still, well, as you could see earlier, she changed her name to Klopp. But they corresponded for the next couple of years after meeting. In 1949, Ed was transferred to Bettles. And Ed and Amber corresponded until she finally married him, either because they ran out of ink or she just got tired of answering the letters. But upon her return to the territory, she noted in a letter home that she was married and living at the CAA station in Bettles. In the 1940s, the population of Bettles was listed as 10 and sprouted to 47 during the war. Just a place for a pair of newlyweds. What a honeymoon site, eh? After a year together in Bettles, Amber and Ed moved to Unalakleet. Like Bettles, it was cold, isolated, and had an airstrip. Compared to Bettles, it was a sprawling metropolis of about 500 people. Amber taught briefly at the Alaska Native School. She and Ed also owned and operated a trading post. She later accompanied Ed to stations in Glen Allen and Talkeetna before moving to Homer. This couple moved about Alaska, providing important services to those working and traveling in the state. They managed important transportation and communications infrastructure. And the Klopps are but one example of how the Second World War was a pivotal point in the social and economic history of Alaska. Tangible things remained after the war: the airfields, the towns, the ports such as Whittier. And while the tangible things were important to statehood, it was the people that were more important, people with a variety of skills and aptitudes. By 1945, uniformed military personnel accounted for nearly 45% of the territory's population. And without the war, it's doubtful that many of them would have even considered coming to Alaska, never mind living here. And many of those stationed in the territory found a home. Some stayed after their service, others went home and then returned, and some were here when the war broke out and took advantages of the opportunities. After graduating from high school in New Mexico, Ed Herndon worked as a ranch hand and later for the New Mexico State Highway Department. Came to Alaska in 1937, took a homestead just down the road in Homer. He worked as a heavy equipment operator in Anchorage, Kodiak, and other parts of the territory. And during the war, he worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. He was a member of crews working on the Alcan, and he also did some work in the Aleutians. After the war, he spent 7 years with the Road Commission, working on construction projects from Ketchikan to Barrow. He also worked on the Distant Early Warning Network. He was a key and important, but often overlooked part of creating the infrastructure that would enable Alaska to become a state. More importantly, he started his own construction business, which he turned over to his son in 1974, becoming a real root and a foundation for business in the area. I'm not doing slides, I'm very sorry. Mildred and Coke Hughes were married in Alaska in 1939. In May of 42, the government was recruiting for radio operators for aviation stations. They signed up and worked at Moses Point on Norton Sound, the alternate field for Nome, and they dealt with Russians ferrying planes from Fairbanks to Russia. When the Navy began preparing for amphibious operations in the Aleutians, it sought out those familiar with the water since there were so few aids to navigation. One such person was Carl Squeaky Anderson, a short, squat Swedish fellow with a high-pitched voice who had been in Seldovia for many years. Anderson made a living fishing, poaching, and generally commandeering anything that wasn't tied down. When the war broke out, he was under indictment for 19 counts of running illegal furs. The Navy made him a lieutenant commander. He said naval and intelligence were oxymoronic terms. But they used his knowledge of the area. He reviewed the charts that the Navy had and found that some underwater structures that were a danger to shipping were actually 8 miles out of position.
Wow.
He was made the port captain of Dutch Harbor in 1942 and 43, where he built a reputation for getting things done and was among the first ashore at Attu, where he was the beach master. And Anderson distinguished himself in numerous amphibious landings, particularly in the Aleutians, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. After being discharged as an admiral, the only Alaskan to make that exalted rank during the war, Anderson returned to Seldovia. And there he fished and ran a small radio operation. Gus Barton was a married man, and to provide for his family, he took jobs that kept him away for extended periods. Not anything that's very uncommon in Alaska even now. When his 4-year-old son failed to recognize him after one stint away from home, he decided it was time to change jobs. He took a job helping to build Kodiak Naval Base in 1941, and he moved his family there with him. And he later helped build the Alaska Highway. He and his family eventually settled in Homer after the war. Charles Davis came to Alaska as a small child and became enamored with aviation. During the Depression, he worked with his father in the mines at Hope. He worked with the Army Corps of Engineers during the construction of Elmendorf Airfield. And he entered the Air Corps as a pilot, flew B-29s over Japan and piloted one of the first great circle routes from Japan to Washington, D.C. in September of 1945. After discharge, he remained in Alaska and flew for Pacific Northern Airlines and stayed in the reserve forces with the 10th Air Rescue Squadron. His oldest son became a pilot, and his son flew the Alaska Pipeline Supply Route. His daughter Nancy became a flight attendant for Ween Air. On Nancy's first flight, the plane was hijacked. She was able to talk the hijacker into allowing all the passengers off the plane. And once that was done and the plane was back in the air, he decided he wanted to commit suicide. She talked him out of that. He then decided he wanted to fly to Cuba. They eventually landed in Oregon. She received a letter of commendation from President Nixon and received the Alaska Heroism Medal from then Governor Egan. Imagine if Davis had not learned to fly and serve. His children most likely would have not picked up his love of flying, and their impact on the territory and the state would have been much diminished. His impact on statehood was significant, not only through his flying and his service, but through his children. George R. Kahn worked for the Army Air Corps as a civilian aircraft mechanic in Sacramento in early '41. He took the opportunity to be part of a group to come to Alaska and build Elmendorf Airfield. Once he got here, he was drafted. But he took his basic at Fort Richardson, and he was stationed there as an aircraft mechanic until the end of the war. He was discharged in '46 and returned to the territory to work for the Alaska Air Depot, part of Elmendorf Airfield. He was able to purchase a 5-acre tract to improve just south of Anchorage by 1950 and stayed in Alaska for the remainder of his life. Dominic Donatello, interesting guy. He earned a degree in chemical engineering from MIT in 1939. When he came to Alaska in 1943, attached to the 11th Air Force as an aircraft maintenance officer. He served on Anchitka, Shemya, and Attu Islands. And after the war, he worked for an Anchorage engineering firm in the CIA. He met a local woman, and they married. He soon started his own business in the basement of his mother-in-law's home, making bleach cleaners and wax to supply local businesses in the school district with cleaning supplies. By 1958, he had a rendering plant built to make tallow for soap. Now, the byproduct of the rendering plant was meat meal. And rather than ship it to Seattle and be sold there, he decided to build a feed mill. In time, his chemical business covered nearly a block in downtown Anchorage. And as you can see, in 1965, he was selected as the U.S. Businessman of the Year. Does anybody know what Dow Chemical is now called? Don Chemical, pardon me, is now called. Alaska Mill and Feed. Adrian Nolfi worked in Pennsylvania coal mines before the war. After enlisting, he found himself on Attu involved in heavy fighting. A call was put out for men with mining experience, and Nolfi violated the principal military rule of never volunteering yourself by letting the Army know he had worked in mines. He was sent to Sutton, where he helped to develop the mines there for fuel for military installations. Discharged in 1946, he returned to the States to get married. And he and his bride quickly drove back, and they honeymooned on the Elcan. And in February 1947, during their honeymoon, they saw a temperature of 80 degrees below in Snag, Canada. He found an apartment in Anchorage, and he worked as a plumber and pipe fitter with a construction company doing military construction. He and his family eventually homesteaded in Big Lake, and his children still live on that homestead. And I'm sorry, I just couldn't get good pictures of Walter Johnson. He came to Alaska in the spring of '41 to work in Juneau in a gold mine for the summer. He went back to the States that winter to study at the University of Nebraska. At the end of the school year, according to his diary, he, quote, packed a thin cotton blanket and a book of poetry on a 3-speed bike and left Nebraska for good, end quote. He pedaled 1,700 miles to Seattle. There he found a friend from Ketchikan who hired him on as a cook on his Alaska-bound fishing boat. He spent the 40s in the interior. He studied at the University of Alaska, entered the military, took his basic training at Ladd Field, and he was assigned to work in a hospital laboratory at Fairbanks for the next 2 years. After the war, he worked for the Alaska Road Commission during the summers and went back to Fairbanks to study during the winters. And upon graduation, he went outside to attend medical school. He came back to Alaska after finishing medical school, where he went to Bethel on the coast of Milton Sound, and he practiced there for 2 years. The entire area held 12,000 people and had only 2 physicians. He engaged in early telemedicine with nurses in the villages via radio to deal with many issues. And Dr. Johnson was the originator of the plan to train villagers to be local health aides. By the year 2000, there were 500 community health aides in 178 remote villages in Alaska. Ed Reeder went into the Army Air Corps in 1940 and arrived in Alaska in February of '41. He helped to build Elmendorf, and he assembled planes there that came up from the States. He was also a member of a salvage crew that went to Homer a few times to fix aircraft that had mechanical problems and had to land. In 1943, he was able to acquire a homestead in Homer. Discharged in '45, he returned to Alaska in January of '46. And if you see some of these people come back in January and February, it's a testament to how much they really wanted to be. Like George Arcand, he went to work for the Alaska Air Depot. Having been a builder and having a multitude of skills, something's going on.
Oh, with the dad saying move slides.
No.
I'm like that, but
Okay,
said the Johnson.
that's okay.
Okay,
We're good there.
okay.
Arcand went to work at the Alaska Air Depot like George Arcand. Having been a builder with a multitude of skills, he moved to Homestead, where his homestead was. And he began work with a friend to build a bar. Typical serviceman. Later, he and several former GIs worked clearing the right of way for the Sterling Highway, and he found long-term employment with the Road Commission. The war brought money, infrastructure, and most importantly, skilled people to Alaska. A territory without the means to raise revenue, it would never have been able to create the infrastructure needed to become a state. The airfield at Nome alone cost $7 million, and you can see what some of the other installations cost. But during and after the war, work was easy to find and paid well. Women could get work and maintain themselves. Immediately after the war, the military became the largest employer in Alaska well into the 1950s. Those who came had skills. There were radio operators and pilots, carpenters, mechanics, plumbers, people not afraid of hard work, but more importantly, people who stayed, unlike the people that came during the gold rushes. The type of adventurous people required to build a state. Carl Rentschler. Come on, Carl. We're down to the last couple of slides anyways. There you go. Okay. Carl Rentschler earned his degree from Penn State in 1942 and promptly joined the Army Air Corps. He was assigned to Alaska, flying C-47s in the Aleutian campaign. And he also flew an experimental C-47 on pontoons that you can see here. While Rentschler was flying, a young woman named Madeline, who you can also see there, was working for the U.S. Army Air Corps in California, and she was transferred to Alaska. The plan for her was to leave in 6 months, but she met Rentschler, and she married him, and didn't return to the States until May of 1947. He came back only to be discharged, and they turned immediately around and went back. Housing difficult to find, they stayed with friends, they ate rabbits, they hunted, and they worked at what they could. Carl was offered an opportunity to work with Bob Reeve, who had started Revolution Airlines, but he turned him down. Rentschler started a travel agency in Anchorage, but when business got slow in the winter, he took a job with a cold storage firm and a job with the CIA to get through the winter. The following spring, he started a successful real estate business and an insurance company. He became involved with the Statehood drive and was elected to the territorial legislature in 1953. And in 1957, he went to Washington, D.C. as part of the delegation to meet with President Eisenhower during the Statehood campaign. Would Rentschler and the others that we mentioned even come to Alaska without the war? There were 15 names that I mentioned in this presentation. Of those 15, 13 were members of the Pioneers of Alaska. Of the Pioneers, I'm sorry, that came out poorly. My apologies. Until recently, to become a member of the Pioneers of Alaska, you had to be an Alaska resident for 30 years. So that's the important point to take away from much of this. These people stayed. And even though there are a couple people up there, Walter Johnson and Squeaky Anderson were not members, they also stayed. They weren't the people who came up for the rush, either struck it rich, took their money and left, or went bust and left. These folks stayed. The new airlines, the better communications, the more services all made Alaska more able to be a state. And the infrastructure was important, but it was the people that the war brought who took advantage of the opportunities that made the real difference. Without the war, many of these people would never have even thought about coming to Alaska, never mind stay here. But it was those people, the radio operators and carpenters, mechanics, plumbers, physicians, that settled the territory, making use of their skills and talents, laying the foundation for statehood. Thank you.
Good job. Do we have questions?
Yes, ma'am.
The infrastructure list that you had up there, was that in today's dollars or those
That's all in dollars of the time.
16 million and like that?
Yes.
At that time, that's a huge amount of money.
Yes. And Alaska wasn't able to raise the revenue. They weren't allowed, as a territory, they still weren't allowed to raise taxes other than through licensing fees. So they would have never been able to do, I mean, they wouldn't have been able, the territory wouldn't have been able to muster the money to extend the Glen from Matsu to meet the Richardson, which is what General Buckner did, one of the first things he did. Because he had supply backlog and couldn't get things from English to Fairbanks. Railroad didn't have the capacity.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Other questions? I was gonna ask the one that you answer here. What is it about people who are in the military service that opt to stay in Alaska?
At that time in particular, a lot of people, particularly people that joined the military, they hunted, they fished, they spent time outdoors to begin with. And largely rural, particularly in the army. So they wanted that opportunity to strike out. And be in a place where they could build their own lives. That was a good part of it. Yes, ma'am.
In 1955, I was married in Valdez. And the gentleman that I was married to, of course, we had been up there for a few years. Anyway, his relatives had been there for a long time. And in 55, he was inducted in, I mean, you don't volunteer. He was
Right.
told he was gonna do the army in Anchorage. And so, but when you're drafted up here, you can stay up here.
Mhm.
So he stayed all the time and took his training at Fort Greely.
And actually, the same thing happened to my father-in-law and his son. They were drafted, they did their training up here, and they were stationed up here, they stayed up here.
It's not true now, but it was.
Right.
then.
Well, and remember, the army was the biggest service by far in World War II. They had the greatest need for manpower. So you get, a lot of people get drafted into the army rather than into the Marines or in the Air Force didn't exist at the time. Somebody else, yes, I can.
What are your thoughts on how the discovery of oil on Kenai in 1957 influenced acquisition of statehood for the land?
I think that had a great deal to do with it, because you had territory now that they knew a reasonable oil strike on the Kenai. There was also oil available at Catala on the other side of Cordova. There had been knowledge of oil seepages on the North Slope since the 1830s. So people knew that there was oil in the state, and in fact, I may be wrong, it was McKinley or Taft, I can't remember who. Naval Petroleum Reserve number 4 for the Alaska Range. So I think it had a great deal, once you could get it.
That's right.
And prove that you could get it.
They
then-
could get it from here, where back when they didn't know they could bring it from that North
Right.
Slope.
Right.
So they've known about oil up here since, like you said, the 1920s or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wasn't until this one came in that they said, you know, we've been working on statehood up here since 1918.
Right. Actually, the first proposal was 1916, but I agree with you, it's a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but Judge Wickersham really
Right.
started working really hard at it in 1918. And even after the war, after all of that money was spent by the US government in Alaska, once the war was over,
Yep.
they didn't care so much to see us again, but when oil came in here, it only took 6 months.
And the reason it could be developed so quickly here, and more so than the North Slope, you didn't have the land issues. And
No,
it was, here it was just do it.
we were on federal land
Right.
and it was only 13 miles tidewater where a tanker could take it out.
Yes, ma'am.
How did you come upon this assortment of people to
Um,
choose from, or did you have a lot more?
I had more.
Yeah.
I had several more. I was limited to 20 minutes. Not trying to get the bus or anything. But- So I had to pick and choose, and I had to pick who I had photographs of.
But I mean, how did you even come across them, or? Yeah.
I just read a lot.
Okay.
And part of it, and you probably saw the sources, the fond memories, and their books that the pioneers have put out among themselves. And I am a quasi member of the Pioneers of Alaska. I'm a spousal member. My wife was born up here, and she's a member. So that's how I had access to, that's how I knew the books even existed. And then some of the other things came up from Alaska Magazine and Alaska Sportsman, things of that nature. And as I was reading, I said, you know, this is kind of interesting. All these people served and then they stayed, and then, oh my. When I did the first draft of this, I probably had 30 names that I work with, but I had to cut down.
I noticed that you cited something from Elsa Peterson. She's a woman from this area. She
Right.
wrote from this area. Eastburn.
So I've often had a theory that the presence of all these former military guys in Alaska sort of changed the politics. Alaska went into statehood as a democratic state,
Right.
or into the country. But after the post-Cold War buildup, there are a second wave of military guys that came here. You think there's anything to that? Did Alaska become more Republican, more conservative as a result of all these military guys?
And I'm retired military. And now maybe, and what I remember is, hey, we didn't talk about politics very much. It was kind of a provoking thing, but there seemed to be a balance, at least from the people I knew, between those who were conservative and those who were a little more liberal. If you look at how the military votes now, maybe the last 20 or 30 years, they tend to lean Republican. So I would, based on that, I would concur with your assessment. But that was one of the reasons Eisenhower stalled.
Right.
Letting Alaska come in, because he needed a Republican state to balance.
Why?
I would suggest that perhaps it was the oil pipeline that really changed politics.
Oh, that absolutely changed
Major.
politics.
Other questions? Okay, well, we'll have probably some more time at the end here, so let's go on to Christy. Christy Swain is a retired Air Force officer whose career included assignments in Alaska and at NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs. Christy is currently a PhD student in the Atlantic and Northern Studies Department at UAF. And her talk today is the legacy of Canadian-American military cooperation in Alaska.
Okay, hopefully this thing is working now. Let's see how it goes. All right, well, good afternoon. I don't know if this is an enviable spot right after lunch. I'm a little sleepy, but I'll do my best to keep everyone awake. So just to let you know, my presentation really isn't about statehood, because I don't want you to go through this whole thing. When's she going to talk about statehood? But I do actually have at the very end a slide that some photos that I found that don't relate directly to my topic, but I think are just I'll throw those up at the end. So there's a very small little statehood. All right, so let's see. Let's advance this slide. Oh. All right, well, I'll start. Hopefully it'll go. Oh,
There you go.
oh,
Now you can go back. Yep.
all right. In 1934, then Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold led a flight of 10 B-10 aircraft from Washington, D.C. to, you can't really see the map very well, but basically they went from Washington, D.C. to Fairbanks and back. And the purpose of this was really to prove the efficacy of being able to resupply Alaska aerially, and show that if there was an emergency that you could actually get aircraft up there. And again, that map's gonna be a little bit hard to see, but while the Air Force was flying, the Navy was also flying up along the West Coast up to Dutch Harbor. And at the same time, actually, interestingly, the president was on a naval ship that was going out to Hawaii. So kind of some key areas in the Pacific that were of interest to be able to access. But the purpose of his flight was, one, to demonstrate it could be done. Two, to go up to Alaska and evaluate the defenses in Alaska, and then to do significant aerial surveillance to determine where they could put runways, military infrastructure in the future. Now, if you'll notice on that map, to get to Alaska, you've got to transit through another country, and that country is Canada. And at the time in 1934, although when they flew there, the Canadian crowds enthusiastically greeted them, the Canadian government and military was very reluctant to have a bunch of military aircraft transiting their territory. They thought the optics of that were very bad. Plus, there always is a concern on the part of Canadians, if you've got American military in your country, is that somehow infringing on our sovereignty? So the Canadians were reluctant to give permission, but then they were basically persuaded by American diplomats who told them that the refusal was, quote, quite unusual in the existing relations between Canada and the United States and reminiscent of the inhibitions which exist in other parts of the world. So Canada, wanting to be a good neighbor, acquiesced, let them go. So as a result of this flight, it really highlighted, one, the strategic significance of Alaska, two, the value of air power for Alaska's security, and then three, the geographic necessity of working with Canada if you want to provide security in Alaska. And so that brings me to what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that World War II Canadian-American military partnership and evolutions, which really culminated with the Kiska campaign, which we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of this year, provided a baseline that would evolve during the Cold War into coordinated warning and intercept capabilities, a unique binational defense arrangement, and combined exercises in defense of Alaska and the Arctic. And as I was examining the Kiska campaign, I really came across three themes that I thought, as you go into the Cold War, really become quite relevant in looking at this topic. First of all, the idea of military connections between the Canadian and American militaries, particularly amongst the two air forces, very close connections, which become really even closer in the Cold War period. But interposed on that is the always seemingly bumpy path when you have to deal, when any decisions have to be made by the Canadian government. Because the Canadian government is always trying to consider the idea of how do we protect our sovereignty while at the same time promoting solidarity with Americans, particularly in defending North America. And then, of course, anyone who's familiar with operations of any type in Alaska and the Arctic, these two militaries shared these challenges of how to operate manpower, how to operate equipment, how to develop clothing, all those types of things are things that both of these militaries had to work through in, of course, World War II, which you were talking about, and continuing into the Cold War period. So Canadian-American military cooperation in World War II really has this nexus with the Ogdensburg Agreement between Prime Minister Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt in 1940. And essentially, what they agreed to was to, quote, consider jointly the defense of North America as a single problem, end quote. And this agreement created a very important entity, the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, which basically from this point forward was to consider the joint threats to the two nations and come up with recommendations to both governments of projects to go forward with that would help maintain security. And so these major projects that we see occur during World War II in Alaska, the Alaskan Highway, the Northwest Staging Route, the Canal Pipeline, which was discussed by my colleague, Lend-Lease, these are all things that were worked through with this Permanent Joint Board of Defense. Recommendations were made and then they proceeded. Again, you can imagine if the Canadians didn't want American aircraft transiting, how they would feel about a bunch, thousands and thousands of Americans that are building a highway. But having the Permanent Joint Board on Defense helps smooth the way for these to occur. And let's go to the next slide. And what you've got really as a major problem, starting for the Americans in December 1941, and then into the spring of 1942, is what to do about the threat to Alaska. And America had very few assets, military assets in Alaska at that point. And the permanent, so the Permanent Joint Board on Defense basically recommended in the spring of 1942 that the Canadians be prepared to provide military aircraft specifically, but military assets in general for the defense of Alaska, because the Permanent Joint Board on Defense basically said the defense of Alaska is critical to the defense of North America. And so the Canadians reluctantly did send 4 squadrons of aircraft up to Alaska, the first of which actually arrived on June 3rd, which was the date that Dutch Harbor was bombed, followed shortly by the Japanese taking over Attu and Kiska. And so these aircraft arrived and there was actually 2 squadrons went to Annette Island, 2 squadrons went up to Anchorage. And some of those aircraft were very quickly sent to Nome because there was concern at that point with the Japanese in the area that Nome might be threatened. And they subsequently served in various places in Alaska, to include Kodiak. But the Canadians really chafed at the fact that they were being relegated to sort of the back areas, because most of the Canadians that were sent had flown in Europe and had combat experience, actually, in contrast to the American pilots up there who didn't have that combat experience. So the Canadians eventually convinced the Americans that they need to go forward, and that's when they get sent to the Aleutians. They go to Umnak, Adak, and then eventually out to Amchitka. You can see I love this picture. Look at the hut, very, very disorderly. So, but nobody, and I'm not gonna tell them they had to tidy up. All right, so the Canadians end up at Amchitka, and basically these RCF pilots more or less merged with the American, the 11th Fighter Squadron was there. They actually ended up flying American P-40s because one, it was very difficult to get any spare parts for their aircraft, and two, very sadly, the Canadians lost actually 5 aircraft in one day when they were going out to the Aleutians due to weather. 4 of them crashed into the side of a mountain, and one other one was lost in the fog. So because of that, you know, they were basically flying joint missions with the Americans. They were flying an American aircraft. You can see them being painted there with the Canadian insignia. And really by the spring of 1943 into the summer of 1943, these pilots were flying pretty much nonstop, weather permitting, which of course weather in the Aleutians is often bad, but whenever they could go, and they were bombing Kiska, because that's where they had the range to bomb Kiska from there with these aircraft. There were other aircraft bombing Attu. They would fly sometimes 6 sorties a day. They were dropping hundreds of thousands of pounds of bombs, and they were very successful in preventing the Japanese from developing a runway there. They were successful at destroying infrastructure, but the Japanese were very, very well dug in. So fortunately, when they weren't able to destroy the bombing raids weren't able to destroy those. But fortunately, of course, we know the Japanese did depart before the invasion force arrived. And just quickly of note, the first kills in the Aleutians were actually a joint Canadian-American mission. And this was the Canadian who shot down one Japanese. It was a Rufi, which is basically the float plane version of the Zero. And his American counterpart, Major Jack Chenault, shot down the other one. And here's some pictures again of the bombs on Kiska. So as the American-Canadian air power cooperation progressed, and they were supporting the imminent invasion of Kiska, we step back a little bit to how did the Canadian Army get involved in Kiska? It was really the brainchild of these two men here, the American commander of Western Command and the Canadian commander, Canadian Pacific Command. And the two of them had met in the fall of 42 and sort of broadly discussed the possibility of Canadian participation. But then in the spring of 1943, General DeWitt briefed General Pierce on the upcoming invasion of Attu, and General Pierce asked to send observers and then suggested that the Canadians would like to participate in the Kiska campaign. And General DeWitt was delighted at this prospect because, as you know, the Aleutian Theater didn't get a lot of resources, and especially once Attu had occurred and the horrific losses that they had at Attu meant that they could use all the manpower they could get. So the Canadians basically discussed the possibility of sending a brigade, which would be about 5,000 men, to assist in this campaign. And thus the Canadians were sent first to British Columbia to do training. They're taking a little time off from their training in that picture, but they're training in British Columbia. And then the American ships picked them up. They all went to Adak, and for a month they trained with their American counterparts in Adak. And the Canadians reorganized their brigade to better fit with the Canadian structure. They were equipped with American weapons. And again, things proceeded, there's always struggles in military training and operations, but proceeded actually very smoothly, this integration of these two forces. And I think a really particularly poignant example of this Canadian-American cooperation is the 1st Special Service Force. So most people know about them from the movie The Devil's Brigade, know about their exploits in Europe. Well, Kiska was actually their first operation. And so this unit is basically a special forces unit that was put together, comprised of Canadian and American soldiers, and it was a completely integrated unit. same uniforms, same chain of command. Their commander, Colonel Frederick, said there'll be no differentiation between Canadians and Americans. They trained together as one unit, and they had great exploits in Europe, which I won't talk about, but you can watch the movie, which isn't exactly historically accurate, but still a great movie. But in this operation in Kiska, this was their first operation, and they got agreement from both governments to send them in, and they were actually the first on the beaches. Now, and they went in to basically clear the beaches and get ready for the invasion force. They actually had wanted, Colonel Frederick had actually really wanted to go earlier and do reconnaissance, which would have been super helpful, because then they would have known that the Japanese had left. But the US Navy, I was in the Air Force. So. Okay. The US Navy in its infinite wisdom said, no, we can't send anyone in early because then the Japanese will know we're coming. I mean, the fact he had 30,000 men on ADAC training, I think could probably tip them off. So, which it had actually, because the Tokyo Rose was actually talking about the invasion force before it came. So anyhow, they didn't get to go in early. Once they got there, I mean, they didn't know immediately, for those of you who know what happened at Kiska, they didn't know immediately that the Japanese had evacuated. And so unfortunately, there were some friendly fire losses because of that. So here's some nice photos of the Canadians and Americans landing at Kiska on the 15th and 16th of August. And what is, I think really fascinating about this to me in particular is that this cooperation, again, on the military side went very smoothly. Those two military commanders started talking about this in April, sent it up the chains of command, agreement, the American government was agreed, but Prime Minister Mackenzie King and the political leaders didn't find out about this until the 29th of May. They had a war cabinet meeting. That's when they found out about it. Of course, Mackenzie King was apoplectic because he had just had a cabinet meeting talking about how the military needed to be reined in, because they weren't consulting properly. And now here they basically more or less committed forces, and he was kind of the last to hear about it. He did, however, agree, because there were many politically expedient reasons to do so for him. First of all, it showcased that he was living up to his Ogdensburg agreement, that he was cooperating and working with the Americans. Two, it deflected criticism that the Canadians really hadn't done much in the Pacific campaign. They got a lot of criticism, particularly from the Australians, about that. And then also, these forces that they sent were actually home defense forces. So home defense forces were not allowed to leave Canada. They were basically called up. They would serve in Canada to provide defenses needed there. But they had come under a lot of criticism. The government had come under a lot of criticism because they've got all these forces staying at home in Canada when they should be out fighting in Europe. So he thought sending them on this operation in Kiska, they were called zombie troops because of that, because they just were seen as not doing anything, kind of dead troops. So he thought this would help deflect criticism about that, to send those units in there. And so Brigadier General Foster, who led this Canadian brigade, was interviewed by Alaska Life, and he basically he's highlighting this important point that these home defense forces are serving to defend Canada. So they're they technically aren't supposed to be outside of Canada, but what he's saying here is Alaska is just as much, if there's a threat to Alaska, it's a threat to the Canadian homeland. So kind of played in with the politics, which I'm sure his most senior military leaders are pretty well versed in politics. All right, so once arriving on Kiska, the Canadian Brigade was one of the lucky units that got to stay after the fact. Some of them actually were there until January of the following year. And together with their American partners, basically and of course they got there in August, and then they're there for the fall into the winter, not the best time to be in the nations. And there's a series of paintings by a Canadian war artist E.J. Hughes, who actually deployed with the Canadians, which I think do a pretty good job of depicting these pretty tough conditions that they had. You can see the tents down there kind of buried in the snow. And then these are even better, showing just getting to your post as a lookout was difficult. Just trying to get across camp was difficult. And so they shared these hardships with the Americans. And just to circle back, as I mentioned before, the Canadian Royal Air Force personnel that were there also shared the same problem. And in fact, that the 4 that I mentioned that crashed into the mountainside, they're actually buried in Alaska at the Fort Richardson Cemetery. This was Squadron Leader Kerwin, who actually led that flight. So altogether, facing lots of challenges. Now, at the end of World War II, Prime Minister Mackenzie King thought would rid himself of American presence in Canada, that the Arctic was going to basically be able to defend itself. That optimism was very short-lived, as the Soviets had reverse engineered B-29s to the Tu-4. They acquired nuclear weapons, and the Korean War in 1950 basically cements the concern that Alaska and the Arctic are very vulnerable. And so, again, I saw a similar pattern here as you look at this Cold War cooperation between the 2 militaries. It went pretty smoothly. The 2 militaries actually, right after the war, were suggesting that some sort of defensive line, radar line, be created to provide warning against incursion. At the time, this is 1946, it was basically deemed way too expensive and too fanciful to be done. But over the years from 1946 onward, the 2 militaries increasingly developed procedures as to how to defend North America jointly. Because if you've got aircraft coming across, you've got to have coordination. What do you do when it crosses the border? Who can shoot it down? So all these things were worked out amongst the 2 militaries. And one of the things, again, that the military suggested earlier on is that you need a warning line. By the early 1950s, the government took on the concern that this was that what are we going to do? How are we going to provide warning? And so they do actually, they start with the Pine Tree Line, if any of you are familiar with this. They build the Mid-Canada Line, but the problem is it just doesn't not provide enough warning. You need some warning time to get, if you're going to get interceptors up in the air to attack these bombers, you need some warning time. And if you're going to get your nuclear-equipped stacked bombers off the ground and therefore be a viable deterrent, you need enough warning time to get them in the air. So that was the purpose of building the DEW line, and starting in 1955. The main line was finished in 1957, and then they added additional lines. But I could talk a lot more about the DEW line, but I won't go into too much more detail, except to say, as things proceeded pretty smoothly on the military side, the Canadian government again hesitated. In the summer of 1954, the American government gave approval to go forward, and they really wanted to get things started in 1955 so it could be done by 1957, which is what the Western Electric Company that had been contracted said. We get started in 1955, we'll have it done by 57. So they needed agreement from the Canadian government. The Canadian government hesitated for a couple months, because again, they were very concerned about the optics of a bunch of American personnel with equipment going into the Canadian Arctic. They felt that the Canadian public would see this basically as an infringement of Canadian sovereignty. And so they did finally agree, but they basically had a whole list of requirements that the Americans had to follow, and the Americans agreed to them, but they were things that they wanted to make sure that they the Americans were going to follow Canadian law, that there was not going to be any claims to Canadian territory, that Canadian companies would have equal access to contracts, that archaeological scientific discoveries would all be given to the Canadian government, that the local, the Americans wouldn't hunt any animals, the Americans would leave the communities alone, all the very long list. And one of the things that was supposed to happen also is there was supposed to be a joint press release to both the Canadian American publics about the DEW line. And the Americans messed it up because they gave it to the reporters about 18 hours early. It came out on the American side. The Canadians are very upset because they wanted the announcement to go out with an additional announcement that they were going to put in with this long list of here's all, okay, we're doing the DEW line, but here's all the things we're going to do to make sure that Canadian sovereignty is upheld. That part didn't go out with the American message. And so the Canadians were concerned that the Americans now thought that they were basically taking over the Canadian Arctic, and Canadians thought that the Americans were taking over the Canadian Arctic. So they were very unhappy about that. So, and although the Americans, I mean, for the most part, the American military and the American civilians that went were generally pretty respectful of the Canadian rules, but there were always rumors coming out about Americans violating this or that or the other thing, and so that caused a lot of problems for the government. So NORAD followed kind of a similar pattern, and again, I don't have time to talk about it here, but on the issue of constructing and operating the dew line in this northernmost part of the Canadian in the Alaskan Arctic. There's all kinds of interesting challenges that they had to, I mean, they didn't even have, just trying to get supplies up there was an epic. There's a whole bunch of documents up at J-Bear concerning Mona Lisa, which is one of the resupplies. They'd have a couple months in the summer, they have to get all the ships up there. They could fly, some places they could fly airplanes in, but so anyhow, lots of challenges. And just, I guess one other point I should have made back there too, is with the dew line, there was no point, you could build a dew line in Alaska and it would be completely useless. So without Canadian participation with a dew line all the way across, the dew line project really was not going to serve any defensive interests. All right, so when we get to NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. So again, similar pattern. The two air forces basically conceived of the idea of NORAD, which is basically a binational defense command. So basically a command made up of Canadians and Americans that are responsible to protect the borders of Canada and America. And so the Canadian American militaries kind of developed the concept, and this kind of evolved, as I was saying, as they developed the procedures over time of how to do this defense of North America. NORAD was really the logical conclusion of how to do this, to have a command with someone in charge that can make these decisions about things that need to be done to protect the borders. And once again, it followed again the similar pattern where the military developed the concept, and the military basically in 1957 is ready to stand up NORAD. NORAD's ready to go. They got the concept down, they got the plan, and unfortunately, timing wasn't good in Canadian politics because there was an election, and surprisingly, Prime Minister Diefenbaker comes to power. Nobody was expecting that to happen in 1957. So they basically ended up twisting his arm because they needed him to get agreement. They needed his agreement basically to go forward with it. So in 57, the command stands up. Diefenbaker agrees to it, but then he imposes a lot of caveats to it, and he basically requires that it go through a political process. So when you look at the origin date for NORAD, it did actually stand up as a command in 1957, but all the political documentation wasn't completed and signed until 1958. And along the way, Diefenbaker caused all kinds of problems because he wanted to link NORAD with NATO. And the problem with linking NORAD with NATO is that was anathema to the Americans. They did not want NORAD, they didn't want the defense of America in any way associated with NATO, because they didn't feel like NATO was necessarily secure, that NATO would necessarily have the best interests of North American defense. But the Canadians were very much in favor of a tie to NATO, because then it showed the idea of collective defense, which is very high on the scale of things that Canadians love. So again, NORAD, and tying this back to Alaska, NORAD consists of 3 regions. So you have the Canadian NORAD region, the continental NORAD region, which is the rest of the US, and then you have the Alaska NORAD region. So essentially, with this NORAD agreement, the defense of Alaska rests in a binational command. It rests in a command that it is an American commander, the deputy is Canadian, but on any given day, and many days, whenever the Canadian or the American commander is traveling, the Canadian is in charge. So the defense of Alaska's borders was very often in the hands of a Canadian. And the Canadians actually established a permanent detachment at Elmendorf Air Force Base, now Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson, in the early 80s. And this is their patch. And this unit is still there. And when they were sent there, they were basically sent to get integrated in this air defense mission, as they still are today. They fly in the E3, they sit in the ground, and whenever there's exercises, operations, the Canadians are an integral part of all of that. And so one other aspect of Canadian-American military cooperation in the Cold War that I don't think really, well, it comes up now because there's been actually a lot more activity in recent years, but the Canadians very early on started participating in exercises in Alaska, and these were largely airborne troops that were sent in because the idea at the end of the Cold War, everybody realized that the Soviets were not going to land on the Alaskan shores with a massed army and go across Alaska like that. It's not going to. There's no entity on Earth that can do that. So what they were concerned about is the Soviets coming in with an airborne unit taking over airfields, and that's why airfields, in particular defensive airfields, became very important because you needed to defend those airfields against an incursion. And there's a whole other interesting story about Nike missile sites, which I won't go into, but if anyone's up in Anchorage in the summer, you should go on the tour of the Nike missile site. Very interesting. All right, so these exercises began in 1950 and continue through to today. And again, it's Canadians basically coming up and integrating with the American forces. Sometimes they would play the aggressors, sometimes they would play the friendlies. And the exercises over time got bigger and more involved. And so the other, besides basically testing the ability to send forces in and reinforce, another really important part of this was testing Cold War equipment, testing the troops in cold weather, in a cold weather environment, and developing tactics, techniques, procedures, everything that you need to be able to operate in the Arctic. And this is something that, with increasing Russian aggression, Chinese designs on the Arctic, the warming of the Arctic and more accessibility of the Arctic, these exercises have become even more important and even more Canadian participation. This was some exercise activity from 2002, and it really was across the gamut. The Canadians supported naval exercises, they supported land exercises, they supported air exercises, and then even just recently, including in September of this year, the Canadians participated in Operation Noble Defender. And this is a photo that would make Canadian politicians so pleased, because you've got the Canadian aircraft here prominently front and center, displaying the partnership with the Americans, and also displaying, the fact that Canada is ready to, has the firepower and the ability to defend its Arctic and to uphold its sovereignty. And so basically my conclusions were that this Canadian participation, which really was demonstrated in Operation Cottage, the Operation Kiska, sets a foundation that then continues with Cold War military integration. And this cooperation coordination with Canadians within Alaska in particular remains an integral part of Alaskan activity. And what we're looking at today is increased challenges in Arctic security have even accelerated the support for integrated exercises and operational activity in Alaska with the Canadians. And I know this picture doesn't relate directly to that, but I love it because this dog was actually on Kiska with the weather detachment. When the Japanese took it over, the dog was cared for by the Japanese and was there waiting to rejoin the Allies when they showed up. And so I've got one more thing to show you, just to tie into statehood. So I was doing my research on Kiska at JBER, and I came across, this was a 1946 study of military housing. And this is what you were saying, that the last group, the rentlers, they couldn't find housing, right? So this is the problem. So there's a family living in an old beer truck, no plumbing. There's 13 families living in this building that had been condemned 3 times by the city of Anchorage with 2 bathrooms. And so you can see, just by looking at this, and there's all kinds of interesting examples in that particular document about the abysmal state of housing, but all these families were coming with the military and they needed housing and they needed schools and these were all things that that are built up and are gonna help, again, promote that path to statehood. So, sorry, a little side turn there, but really interesting stuff. So, does anyone have any questions?
Have 9 minutes for questions.
Yeah, Christy, wonderful presentation, thank you. I'm wondering, I'm just thinking about, as you noted, Canada is just so central for resupplying Alaska in general. And so I'm wondering about how Canadian-American cooperation evolved over time when it came to logistics. And so whether that was the history of the Alcan after 1945 and the two governments figuring out how are we going to maintain this road, or even when it came to pipelines, right? The Fairbanks-Haines pipeline that came online in the 50s. Did you find much evidence that concern over those logistics helped bring the militaries together as part of the NORAD effort, or is that yeah, I'm just curious if you found anything along those lines, or if it was much more kind of high level. I don't know, I'll leave the question there if I can find this.
Well, I would say, I mean, particularly for the Air Forces, I wouldn't say it was a logistical thing that brought them together as much. I mean, that would be more so for the Army, and it would probably be more in terms of logistics, at least from what I was looking at, the DEW line was probably the biggest logistical cooperation. It wasn't purely military, because there was a lot of civilian logistics. But, I mean, you've got the logistics, I guess, of bringing Canadians in for these exercises, but those, I mean, those weren't massive logistics.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, I guess from what I've looked at, and that's my personal experience, I just, the two militaries seem to be very compatible in terms of their kind of outlook on life. And I mean, generally, when we talked about the American military being a little bit more on the conservative side, the Canadian military tends to be a little more conservative leaning than the general Canadian public. And so I think, and I mean, you find this even when you do exercises, which we don't do anymore with the Russians, and them being really very different from us, when you get two pilots in the room or two military people in the room that kind of do the same type of thing, so you find there's a connection. But I think with Canada, it's like it's even more, it's a cultural connection, and then it's that military connection. So I guess that's more what I found, but I mean, I haven't really looked specifically at that. But cooperating, I mean, anything that they cooperated on kind of helped.
Sure.
Cement that. So, I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
No,
very
that's
well.
fine.
Oh,
Yeah, Chris, a question, based on what you've learned about the Canadian and American relationships, is any of that applicable in terms of the current crises we're facing in Ukraine in terms of cooperation of the militaries?
well, in fact, that's kind of what I'm trying to look at for my dissertation is the history of this cooperation. And is there actually greater applicability? I think Canada and the US have a very unique military relationship. What other two nations entrust basically their borders to another nation? So I think in that sense, it is a very unique relationship, but can we develop better cooperation with other nations along those lines? I think that's a question I am pondering, actually. I mean, it's an excellent question, but we need, I mean, America can't fight, we haven't fought alone, we can't fight alone, and we can't maintain security alone, and particularly in the Arctic. This is an area where we have to cooperate both, and security involves much more than military security. There's a broad range of security problems that must be tackled, and how to cooperate with other allies, and how to eventually, hopefully, cooperate with the Russians if they ever stop their aggressive activity. But we have to cooperate with them at some level. I mean, there is still some cooperation going on with that. But I think this is, personally, I think something that's not really been studied very much, the Canadian-American cooperation and the extent of it, particularly in Alaska, which I don't think people usually don't even know there is a Canadian detachment in Alaska. And I'm not even sure how many people, well, a lot of people don't really know much about there was even an Aleutian campaign, but knowing that the Canadians were actually an integral part of the Aleutian campaign is lost on most people as well. I mean, you all are historians and interested in history, so you probably know, but a lot of people don't. So I think it offers some lessons that we can hopefully apply elsewhere.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what, in the Atlantic, wasn't there a US base in Newfoundland at the time? And yeah, I've been there and people say there are all these marriages between, the sort of US servicemen and Canadian women. They weren't, it wasn't part of Canada yet, in during World War II, because it entered, it was consolidated in Canada later, but what were the differences? Was there less resistance in the Atlantic, or was there, was the base there of a different nature? I mean, politically, you say there was a lot of feelings that sovereignty might be compromised, etc. And in Alaska, was it the same in Newfoundland?
The Canadians were always concerned, the Canadian government was always concerned wherever Americans went in large amounts, particularly military, they always were concerned. And they set up those bases because they need actually originally to get aircraft over to the European theater. So, I mean, it was all basically for security reasons, but those were set up. And it's interesting, actually, I've been doing some research on the DEW line, and there were Americans up in that area, and then when they start building the DEW lines, the Americans are there, and some of the interviews, they actually said they liked the Americans better, because when the Americans were there, the Americans, I guess the American military had more money, they would give things to the local communities if they had extra building material or fuel. And then when the Canadians came up, the Canadians really didn't want anyone to interfere with the local community. So the Canadians would come up and say, no, we don't want you to be interfering. And then the Canadians would try and, set up, build housing, so they were basically interfering directly in the day-to-day lives of the local communities. And so they kind of presented the Canadians, and they sort of liked the Americans in that one microcosm, but like the Americans weren't really interfering with what they were doing day to day, but basically were, generous in giving them. They would have Christmas parties for the kids on the DEW line sites and things like that. So I mean, I thought it was sort of interesting because the American military gets a bad rap when it goes anywhere else, but in that case, they like them better.
So you were talking a lot about Air Force and Army, but I'm wondering, we do have a big dispute between Canada and the US, but the US and everybody, where we're not signed on to the law of the sea. We're arguing with the Canadians on outer continental shelf and who has the right to control the Northwest Passage. So that's Coast Guards. And I'm wondering if there's something substantially different in terms of how we're cooperating or not cooperating on the oceans and coastal issues as opposed to the terrestrial.
I think actually our our expertise, the cooperation is actually very good in that area. And actually your question made me think of something else that I think, well, I talked about these problems on the governmental level, on the military level, there's really, they find it much easier to work through these things, like the Northwest Passage issue. On the military side, it doesn't really cause the consternation that it does in the political realm. And the military, and actually I forgot to mention this too, that's my fault, in my paper, but when it came to the Kiska campaign, Mackenzie King basically made this one requirement, well, many requirements. One was that they could not embark the troops to Kiska without somebody coming from the government coming to inspect it. And General Pierce was basically there at Kiska, loading all his men he was actually standing in the rain the whole time, loading his men, and they were on the ships waiting for the government to give its permission for them to go. And it came at the last hour, but Pierce said in his diary, basically, I was going to send them anyways. So the Canadian military is generally quite eager, and Mackenzie King also wanted an invitation from the US government to participate, whereas the military wants to engage, they want to be, you know, seen as equal partners, and so the military is always kind of more forward leaning on that sort of thing, and again, and as far as, I mean, Coast Guard, we even cooperate in the Coast Guard level with the Russians, so
Right,
Coast Guard level.
right. We still have the agreement of search and rescue, even though.
Right, and you've got it in search and rescue, but you have to cooperate on some level, but I just always find that it's very different when you talk about the military side where they really just wanna make things work.
Yeah.
And the government side where, you know, North passions with ours, if the Americans do this, it sets a precedent, the American military is like, let's just go with the Americans through the Northwest Passage and stop. Blathering on about it.
We're eating into our coffee break here. Does anybody have one more question or one break?
Knowing how everything ended up on chain of command, it's here, and I forget the US guy,
To wit,
yeah. Was one above the other, or were they completely?
so neither one was in charge, when it came to Kiska, neither one were, I mean, they were the heads of those two overall commands, but for the Kiska operation, there was an American in charge. But then there was a Canadian brigadier general that was in charge of the Canadian brigade. So, but in NORAD, basically it's set up where there's a commander and a deputy. And for the continental US and Alaska, it's an American senior and Canadian deputy, and then in CANAR, it's the Canadian deputy and Canadian senior and American deputy. So NORAD is set up like that, and so, yeah, but at Kiska, with me, for the military, you've got to have one person in charge, you can't have multiple people, so it was at Kiska, and the Canadians were 5,000 of about a 30,000 force. So they didn't have like a second in command Canadian, but they did have a Canadian brigadier general that was there shepherding the Canadian.
Okay, two great presentations.